I'm on now, am I? Hi, morning everyone. Thank you for being bright-eyed after the night before and coming along here. I'm Ross Fairley. I'm a partner in the law firm Burges Salmon. If you hadn't guessed we're a law firm, you should have because it's up there. We have a stand here over there, so do pop by if you want to learn a bit more about us. But we specialise in a number of areas, and the two biggest areas we specialise in are energy, from whence I come, and transport. So I'm a bit of an interloper on this whole event, being, as I am, an energy lawyer. And so I'll throw something immediately out there for you to ponder on. And that's, I don't think enough is being done or thought about the energy implications of electric vehicles at the moment in the UK. And Chair's prerogative, I'll just leave that one hanging out there and not expand on it at all, let you think on that, and instead allow the panel here, a very august panel, to introduce themselves rather than me trying to do it for them. So I'm going to hand over to Daniel.
Hi. My name's Dan Saunders. I'm from Octopus Investments, and I lead our transport solutions service. So essentially, Octopus Investments, we are an investment manager. You probably guessed by the name. We manage about 7.2 billion of assets in the UK. And we've got a very, very big presence in renewable energy, but what we see is a great opportunity to invest in clean transportation, EVs, through a pay-as-you-use service. So we call it transport as a service, where we invest in vehicles, all the necessary infrastructure, including on-site charging and network reinforcement on a pay-as-you-use model for fleet operators.
So I'm Mark Kemp. I'm here representing the Association of Directors of Environment, Economy, Planning and Transport, ADEPT. I'm also the chair of the UK Network Management Board, which is a subgroup of the UK Roads Liaison Group, the national group that looks at where legislation is going around network management and those sorts of things. For my day job, for my sins, I'm actually the Director of Growth Strategy and Highways at Buckinghamshire County Council. So I'm kind of the local authority sanity in the group.
Morning, I'm Richard Ward-Jones. I lead business development across Amy's consulting business, and I guess electric vehicles is a subject fairly close to my heart. My background is highways ITS, highways intelligent transport systems, and just saying 11 years ago my dissertation was the promotion and uptake of alternative fuel vehicles in the UK, so whether or not I got that right remains to be seen.
Hi, I'm Ed Barrett. I'm a legal director at Burges Salmon. My practice crosses transport and energy. So, for example, since 2015, I've been working with the Ventura Consortium, the Innovate UK funded driverless car project in Bristol. Also working with RoboPilot, with Arrival and UPS. So that'll be looking at the use of autonomous driving technology with electric delivery vehicles. Also currently working with another contractor in terms of putting together a delivery model for electric charging points across London with TfL. And for the record, Richard had already told me that his predictions from 11 years ago have proved to be true, so you should set great store by what he says this morning.
Okay. Thank you very much, panel. You see we've got a great distinguished group of speakers here, so I'm going to keep quiet and just ask some questions. This is a panel debate, and unlike question time, I have to tell you that the panel do know a few of the questions that I'm going to pose them, but I don't know, they don't know, and you don't know what they're going to say, so we're going to wing it a little bit. We would welcome comments from the floor, but if I could ask you to let the speakers speak and not interrupt them. If you want to make a comment from the floor, just grab my attention and we'll make sure we get a mic to you and you can chip into the debate. That would be most welcome indeed. So to kick off then, first question to sort of set the scene. Do you actually believe the predictions on the growth of electric vehicles? And let's start at the beginning with Daniel.
Okay, so from Octopus's standpoint, very much so we believe electric vehicles is going to happen. I think we'd be lying if we said we knew exactly how quick the uptake was going to be, but much like what we saw with renewable energy generation, we believe this is going to be a very, very large opportunity for the UK and for globally. And we can see the pressure being put on any consumer of vehicles, really, to go to zero emissions. You look at all the data that's coming out in terms of health and the environment, and it's then ultimately an uptake question. Some projections, or at least the projections that we're seeing, seem to change every few months, whereby the uptake gets quicker and quicker and quicker. It's really then a case of, from our perspective, can we invest and help accelerate that uptake? So, I don't know.
Okay. So I think there's a political element to this. We've got a lot of new mayors across the piece, and to some degree, if you look at what happened around congestion charging in London and how that changed behaviours in London, kind of how the mayors pick up some of this stuff around air quality, etc., in the urban areas, would to some degree steer how quickly I think this thing happens. But I do believe it is going to happen. I think there's a bigger question about, is it really zero emissions in the round, and it's sort of more about the kind of residential areas and urban environment. But I think that actually how brave our politicians are will determine how quickly things change.
So I think my view is it's not a case of whether it will grow. I think that's almost a guaranteed. It's how it will grow and how that market will evolve. It's a great market for statistics. It's 2,000% growth in the number of EVs on the network since 2012. And actually, if you look at the numbers today, 5% of vehicles sold in September, I think it was 5.2% this month, so 1 in 20 vehicles are EVs. And so that's sort of fairly solid evidence that I think the growth is happening. And actually, I guess from any angle, whether it's OEM strategy, and you've got Jaguar Land Rover, Volvo, BMW, all going either fully hybrid or an electric, sort of in a really short timescale, or bringing an awful lot of new EVs and hybrid vehicles to the market. If you look at government policy, the sort of ban on petrol and diesel engines by 2040, it's 2032 in Scotland. I think that's a clear driver. Locally in London, you've got the T-charge, you've got the ultra-low emission zone coming, clean air zones. And actually, I think the public perception as well, and that's a key driver, but it is getting better. I think that anxiety over kind of range and running out of fuel is kind of lessening. So I think whichever way you look at it, it's going to be a market that grows.
Yeah, no, I'd second everything I've heard there. I think the answer is yes, but we don't know how quickly. We don't know quite how it's going to arrive. There are lots of factors that are going to drive that. And if you look at some of the stats, government's positing by 2030 that between 30 and 70% of new car sales may be electric vehicles. So there's quite a range there. You listen to other analysts, they're talking about peak oil in 2030. So I think my view would be, yes, we will see growth. We will see a lot of growth. It will probably be, or it will be, as part of a mixed-use solution, probably for longer than we might expect. There'll still be internal combustion engine use for an extended period, and a reliance on hybrids possibly for longer, particularly if we can't solve the investment in infrastructure issues that need to be worked through.
Okay. Can I ask a follow-up question, though, on that, and at the risk of upsetting our audio crew out there, if you just want to stick your hand up and say who's prepared to answer this one. But we talk about EVs, and we lump EVs together as one amorphous mass. But within EVs, you've got all sorts of different types of vehicle. And I just throw out the issue of freight vehicles and various things like that. Are we going to see a difference there? Are we going to see different technologies? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think personally, I was at an event the other day actually called Freight in the City, which was held at Alexandra Palace, and if the number of freight vehicles being displayed with full battery electric technology, admittedly in the early stages, it was pretty impressive. And whilst people appreciate that the battery technology still has some way to go, both for light commercial vehicles and the larger vehicles, most definitely, it is coming. You hear about the developments in battery technology, and you can see why it can be perfectly applied. I guess then the question then comes back again to the infrastructure to make that a valid solution. So bigger batteries, you need greater charging capacity. How does that trickle essentially down the entire infrastructure chain? So yeah, I do think it's coming.
I think if you look at what the Mayor consulting on the London plan at the moment is saying around where he's looking to go with electric vehicles and freight, maybe it is about size of battery, those sort of things, but maybe it's about delivering it in a different way as well. And some of this might be about changing the kind of planning situation where we have more distribution centres around the outsides of our main urban environments, and then freight being ferried in and the smaller vehicles. Now, of course, that also links to the move to web-based shopping and the fact that a lot of us don't nowadays. My son, I don't think, knows what a shop looks like. Everything's arrive at our door in a brown parcel from a vehicle. So actually, the way we're doing all this stuff is very different, and that I think will link to that freight stuff. Also, the other thing is the link between that efficiency in connected vehicles and whether we can actually get, for the longer journeys, more efficiency out of the vehicles that way, which will support the range of our electric vehicles.
I think we're seeing the growth and the rapid pace of technological change. You've got Tesla, who are just about to announce their new electric lorry. And I think the flyers are out now with a vague shadow of what it might look like. But whether or not it's electric, it might be hydrogen, and a lot of people are saying actually for the larger vehicles, hydrogen is going to be perhaps the solution that we get sooner. Remains to be seen. Like the technology, as I say, is evolving so fast, they could play a part. And I think absolutely, like good vehicles, the business case is almost there today to invest in electric.
Yeah, I think all I'd add would be, I was at that Freight in the City event as well, and one of the interesting interventions there was from the guy from Mercedes, who was saying that he was asked a question about diesel vehicle sales and them falling off a cliff, and he said, well, that's true for cars, but actually for heavy freight, it's remained constant. So because at the moment there just aren't the alternatives. So it's a more nascent technology when you come to heavy freight. So I think in the medium term, certainly you're going to see other alternatives for a switch to low carbon, certainly in the heavy freight market.
Okay, thanks panel. So next up, let's get straight into it with the infrastructure side. What comes first, the infrastructure or the vehicles, or what is effectively coming first up? And I suppose the other way of putting that is, will the infrastructure inevitably arise because the source of electric vehicles and the demand is there and is happening? Who wants to go first?
I don't mind kicking off. I think, for me, both have to come together. I think in terms of the public's confidence in making the switch to electric, that infrastructure has to be visible. So I think we need that investment, and I think the government subsidy around infrastructure at the moment is really important to continue to drive that. I think we're going to need that continued investment for a fair period to come. I guess the other angle, like looking at it, is to scale it up and to roll it out is the private investment and de-risking the investment model to allow that scale up. Is going to be a huge factor that sort of drives the infrastructure piece, and I think you'll see the cars just by virtue of the fact that the OEMs are manufacturing them and people will buy them.
Well, that's probably a nice link into you, Daniel.
And I think from an investor's perspective, that's pretty much spot on. There is definitely the appetite to invest in the infrastructure, and the infrastructure is absolutely necessary to make this a sustainable long-term solution. But there is, from like all investors, the main thing to look at is, well, what are the risks of putting money into something that's never used? And that's really where essentially the government can help, just by essentially helping to kick this off, so that the whole investment market can see, right, this really has got traction, this is going to get backed, this is going to get used, and then they can start taking more risk.
We've got a gentleman over there who wants to say something.
Oh, yeah.
Man from the audience.
Do you want to? We'll come to you in a moment.
Yeah, just while the microphone's getting over to the audience. I mean, I think if you look at the way broadband has been rolled out across the UK, then there's kind of a similarity. So we're going to get to a place where actually in the urban environments, that's a pretty commercial environment. I think there's a challenge for us around the complexity of the commercial bit. I mean, I think at the moment you need God knows how many apps to work out that you can get electricity from whichever power point you happen to get to at the time. So there needs to be something around the kind of smart ticketing type solution that gives you an easy answer to that. But then when you start getting out to rural areas, I think that is far more of a challenge. Maybe government will need to step in again and say, actually, how much of that, what kind of coverage do we really need nationally?
I think in terms of that question around, like, does the infrastructure need to lead, it almost leads into the related question of, what do people want? Because if you look at the successes of recent years in transport or in retail, you look at the Ubers of this world, you look at the focus of the driverless car projects, it's all around user experience, and people want convenience, and they don't want complexity. And so in order to provide them with a solution that's easy to use, you're going to need the infrastructure behind it. And what we risk otherwise is having a disconnected pattern across the country and that sort of patchy take-up that you're describing.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a question over there. So if anyone asking questions, if you could just let us know your name and where you're from, that would be great.
David Heitch from Cheshire. The question for me is not so much whether it's infrastructure or vehicles. I think we can see now that vehicles are coming out of the manufacturers, that infrastructure is going in. For me, the biggest problem is the one that's just been touched on, and that is how easy is it for the customer to pay and to use, both in terms of the, if you like, the cable and the plug on the end of it that goes into which particular vehicle, because there are some differences. But more importantly, how do they get to be able to pay if they do turn up at a charge point, whether it's in a motorway service centre, whether it's in a supermarket, whether it's a leisure park, whether it's a hotel. Because at the moment, in the sort of innovation rush and the pioneer stage, there are as many charging mechanisms as there are infrastructure projects. And I think we need to get a mindset amongst those infrastructure operators that says they need to think very hard how they make it easy for people to operate.
I think the customer is so important to this. And if you look at the government last week, the week before last, published its new automated and electric bill, and that's about three things. It's about the provision of infrastructure, it's about smart chargers, and it's about the customer, and it's about absolutely avoiding the situation where we get a patchwork of EV networks across the UK, and actually you can only use the one that you're a member of, and you end up with 11 different RFID cards that you have to sort of juggle between when you go to different counties or different regions. So I think how that kind of plays out is going to be really important, but the customer has to be at the centre. As a user, you want to be able to turn up at any EV charge point and be able to use it, and for that to be an easy, kind of stress-free process.
Okay, can I just add a supplemental to this discussion, and perhaps it links into that as well, because when we talk about infrastructure here, everyone immediately jumps on the idea of charging points, as if charging points will materialise everywhere and can be installed everywhere. When we mean infrastructure, what infrastructure do we actually mean? Because it goes much wider than just purely sticking a charge point in a car park. And as we heard yesterday at the talk, there's some real restraints and constraints on where you can put these charge points, particularly if you're going to roll out multiples of them. So does anyone want to comment on that?
So at least what we've seen, or what we believe, is that there won't be one size fits all. There will be, a mixture depending on what is the right solution in that environment. So, for instance, you will have on-street charging points, but you will also have, for want of a better term, petrol stations, where you have the charging points, a high voltage charge at those points whereby you can stop for 15 minutes, go and grab a cup of coffee, have your car charged, and then come back. The other point to note is that for commercial operators, there's an even greater challenge, because if you're charging 50, 100 vehicles at the same time, you need to ensure that you've got the capacity in the substation on that local network. So you've got to reinforce that as well. So it goes much, much further than literally what you can see, the charge going into the car. You've got to make sure that the network that sits behind it is fully reinforced so that you don't knock out the power supply to others. And that's, that's a big infrastructure spend there.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think infrastructure is even broader than that. So we talked about charging. There's that whole kind of financial infrastructure behind it that makes it work. But I think the other thing I was going to say in terms of the charging issue is we've talked very much about the battery staying in the vehicle. Actually, are we going to be in a place where, much like you swap your patio gas heater bottle, that you come in and into a garage and you swap a battery and drive off? Is that the way we're going to be able to deal with this charging concern in the short term as battery technology improves? I think that's the other thing as we watch, battery technology improve, and the ability to store energy, batteries getting lighter and lighter. That kind of all helps with this, and maybe you get to the point where the majority of us are just plugging our car in at home most of the time.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with all that. I think the sometimes the danger with these sort of questions is that we try and sort of leap to the end stage in terms of an answer. I mean, the nirvana will be some sort of solution whereby, for the consumer, there's a very nice, easy ability for them to turn up and charge their cars, and behind that, a complex web of grid balancing, commercial contracts, investments, etc. That's probably that's going to be several years down the road. And so I suppose the trick is really, how do we get to that point, and how do we identify those elements of the puzzle that we can fix in the medium term that will provide investment returns and will provide a basis for longer term growth. That's the one that we're really sort of grappling with at this point, I think.
I think that leads nice. Sorry, question here. If we can get a mic across, Susanna, thank you. Yes,
thanks. Peter Allen from Highways England. I've been interested to hear the panel's thoughts on. We've focused a lot on the supply side of electric vehicles, the charging points, the infrastructure, and the technology. To what extent do the panel feel that the demand side is influenced, and where are the risks on the demand that it might go off in a different direction? You mentioned Uber and other initiatives like that. To what extent is the demand being influenced?
Thank you for that. Yep.
I think that comes back to my point about the political aspirations and the mayors and what they're doing. So what are people doing to encourage those changes, and where are they doing it? I mean, I think there's always a bit of a, for those of us who are old enough to remember this, a VHS Betamax concern around all this. But I think that's going to be driven by in urban areas by mayors rather than anything larger than that. I think it's going to be an air quality thing that's going to push people to make those changes.
Does anyone else want?
Well, I think that's right, and you've already seen sort of the pushback from local authorities, particularly on things around diesel emissions and what the low emission zones are going to look like, and I can only see that increasing. And I think for me that's one of the big gating items in terms of, along with grid capacity, how do you actually get to this sort of full or near full EV take up in the short term to medium term? That political dimension is going to militate against really strict regulations within the low emission zones that are part of what drives this.
I think that I guess you've got different classes of users. You've got the fleets, electric vehicle fleets, and you've got your individuals who are going to use their car for commuting or kind of taking their kids to school. I think the sort of drive from the fleet market is going to be significant. Heard it said that already that business case stacks up to go electric. So I think that is going to drive an awful lot of change. And just, I guess, on that subject, if you look at taxi fleets, London's talking about ultra-low emission zone 2020, bringing that forward to 2019. That's tens of thousands of vehicles. And on the other side, on the infrastructure side, you've got them investing in 300 rapid chargers by 2020. 300 rapid chargers isn't going to service that many vehicles in London. So I think the fleet market is going to, and the demand and the business case is going to stack up and drive it.
Okay, we've got a question at the back there.
Good morning, Jeremy Twigg from RGL. Question for Richard. You mentioned...
Could you speak up? Sorry.
Sorry, yeah. Large fleets of HGV vehicles turning over to electric or possibly being hydrogen. What's the likelihood of using hydrogen in fuel cells for small vehicles in terms of efficiency, and that would reduce the demand on electrical charge points. Has that been looked at?
So the debate between hydrogen and electricity.
So I'm no expert in hydrogen, and it comes back to the same debate. There's so many technologies being developed at the moment, and you've got the likes of Dyson now entering this market. Apple, Google's are talking about this. What the technology looks like, it remains to be seen. I think that you're going to find that there's lots of different types of technology. I think hydrogen will play its part already in the rail industry. There's an awful lot of talk about the role hydrogen can play. There's huge challenges in how you distribute the hydrogen around the network to actually be able to fill up. But it will play a part, but I'm not an expert. I don't know enough about how quickly that's going to kind of come to bear. Certainly, electric vehicles are going to be here first.
Certainly, it's an interesting one for the car makers, and it's sort of certainly it's an interesting one for the car makers, and it sort of plays into that sort of debate about how do they retain market share. And I think the thing that's militating against it in many respects is the complexity of it against pure EVs. And so you get somebody like Toyota who say, we're going to major on this because it's difficult. Because it's difficult to make this technology work, we see value in it, and we see it's more difficult for the software majors to come in and take our business from us. Now, whether that works in the longer term or whether the simplicity of EVs work, we don't know. But it's a really interesting question.
Daniel.
Yeah, so just to say, we've seen quite a lot of interest for hydrogen because we're looking across the full spectrum of the technologies. And we can completely see why for heavier goods vehicles works really well. Same principle really for compressed natural gas if it comes from the right source. The technology's there, it works. One of the things that we've been struck by when we've met with operators is the fact that for hydrogen vehicles, you take essentially a donor vehicle and you convert because there's not many OEMs out there. And when you start comparing that to maybe the smaller vehicles, cost comparatively, the hydrogen's significantly more expensive. We've seen it a lot with buses, whereby you've got the hydrogen-powered bus, you've got the electric bus. I think the electric bus is working out roughly half the price. So it's a significant difference. And part of that, or I say part, a lot of that's to do with literally just economies of scale and having to invest in new infrastructure. So just like Richard said about having to move the hydrogen around, physically around the country, you've actually got an electricity grid there ready to be built on. Admittedly, it's not the perfect electricity grid. There's lots that needs to be done to reinforce it, but you've got the platform to build from for electricity. And that's, I think, ultimately why we think electricity will win out in the end. There will be a mixed level of technologies in the market to fit what people need and what operators need. But for the majority, we feel that electricity will be the winning technology.
Okay, thanks. Let's move on to the next question, and what entities will need to be corralled in order to deliver the growth in electric vehicles. And while you're all pondering that and thinking about that, I'll take the chair's prerogative and just chip in and say that in all of this, what you have is a huge focus by the government at the moment on delivering highways infrastructure and charging points and the electric vehicles themselves. And at the same time, in energy policy in the UK, the decarbonised energy policy, you are seeing the government retrenching and withdrawing at the moment from a number of those decarbonised technologies. And if electric vehicles are going to grow in the way that they're going to grow, we're going to need decarbonised energy because no one will tolerate driving around with brown power. That's just ludicrous. So we do need to get the energy suppliers, the energy companies, and the distribution network operators on side. And you might say, well, that's a plug for renewables, which it is, but also it's a point around things like battery storage. So at the moment, we've got a huge boom in the UK on battery storage technology. But just as that is being promoted and pushed, again, there is a retrenching of all of the benefits and to a large extent some of the subsidies that have incentivized that movement, just at a time when deployment's going out there. And if you think about the grid constraints around the UK that will be needed to be tackled by installing charging points en masse, there will need to be developed storage technology. So I guess coming from the energy perspective, and you'll excuse the hijacking of this, but I really, really do think that the government needs to think about how it's merging those two together and doesn't take away and disincentivize one hand while it's pushing something else which will inevitably be dependent on the other. Anyway, does anyone want to come back on the who needs to be corralled?
I think I would just pick up your point on the network. I mean, I don't know how many of us here went to the last session yesterday, where Mr. Coker was talking about trying to answer that question. You know, what needs to be done to the network in order to facilitate take up of EVs, and his view was that actually there's sufficient capacity in the network at the moment, you know, provided you charge at the right time. So, you know, part of solving this puzzle is getting a delivery model for the consumer, which enables them to charge when they want, but harnesses the power from the grid at the right time. That might be a battery storage solution. It might be some form of, you know, recognition of the actual costs of charging at particular times. But there have to be delivery models developed that respect the limitations of the grid, but also provide for, you know, the take-up of the technology that we're all talking about.
Just to say, you know, we're talking about storage. You've got to remember also that the vehicles are actually storage themselves. You know, they're batteries on wheels, and so the opportunities for smart charging and vehicle to grid, where, you know, for those in the room that don't know the terminology, essentially the vehicle literally putting electricity back into the grid at peak demand times. That's huge potential that can be monetized for the owners of the vehicles. So there is really an opportunity to balance how the vehicles become part of the total energy infrastructure solution.
I think.
Okay, so we talked a lot about some of the challenges. What are the opportunities that are out there for the private sector in all of this? Does someone want to kick off with that?
I mean, I guess there's the obvious investment in the design, planning, build, operation, maintenance of the EV infrastructure that's going to be required. And I think there's a huge piece around the research and development of battery storage, of new smart and chargers capable of vehicle to grid. At the moment, I'm only aware of one vehicle to grid charger in the UK at Aston University. There might be more than that, but there's not many of these things. And if we're going to try and balance that demand, and we're going to use electric vehicles as part of the energy solution, as part of our grid, then there's significant investment required, I think, in that space. So there's a huge opportunity for private sector there.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that comment from Richard. Essentially, I think if you ask any investor in either infrastructure or energy, they see this as absolutely the future opportunity, almost the follow-on from what's happened in renewables and big infrastructure projects. The potential is enormous, and it's enormous because it impacts everybody and every entity, essentially, but it has potential to actually do some social good. So people want it for numerous reasons, and that makes it a very, very powerful opportunity. I also think, coming back to what we touched on slightly earlier, though, was that the demand levels, I can certainly see a position whereby vehicles are going to be, the demand to own them is going to drop. You know, the idea of vehicle sharing or vehicles on demand will grow. And that will be both for consumers, but also for companies. You know, why be asset heavy? Why not be asset light and just access these vehicles as and when you need them? So I think it's going to be a really interesting time for the private markets to, you know, there's going to be volatility, but a lot of opportunity.
And sorry.
So yeah, I think over the last few years, we've seen far more closer working relationship between the private and the public sector. And I actually think, whilst there are clearly opportunities for the private sector, I think one of those opportunities is to work closer with the public sector in terms of how they're delivering these things, whether it be in the planning world, whether it be in the transport authority world. But I think some of that closer working that is kind of become the modus operandi nowadays of the way we're going is where we ought to be looking. And I have to say, I suspect with all the stuff around charging and procurement and all that kind of stuff, there must be a hell of an opportunity for lawyers, but there you go.
It was interesting. I was talking to someone yesterday and they said the big opportunity in this market, and I appreciate this was one perspective, but they actually said it's the chemicals industry. The chemicals industry can get a big boost on this by developing new products. And we haven't perhaps looked as closely as we should do about the battery technology and the battery development. The other thing I was told the other day is that, for example, lithium and lithium recycling is just astronomically expensive and very difficult to do. But one can imagine at some stage someone's going to come up with a solution there that will allow that to be recycled properly in an appropriate way. And there's an issue there for government in promoting one thing, but then if it's looking at its overall environmental goals, what's it going to do about using, raw and virgin lithium here, there, and everywhere? So those sorts of things, I think, are massive opportunities for the private sector. I suppose, not wishing to be too parochial about this, but do you see that this is a massive opportunity for the UK and the UK's industrial strategy, or do you think the majority of this technology will be developed elsewhere? Any comments on that?
I would say that the UK has made it fairly clear that it wants to be a market leader, not just in EV, but in connected autonomous vehicles, and it has put significant levels of investment already. Hundreds of millions of pounds has been invested in this space. So I think the UK is very clear that it wants to be a market leader in shaping this sector and shaping how it evolves, which is really positive from a UK infrastructure kind of point of view. But there's also lots of activity going on in Silicon Valley and elsewhere in the world. China is, like in everything, taking over the world. It's got way more than half the EVs in the world already, and they are growing rapidly.
Okay. Should we be thinking more about, and I suppose this touches on what we were talking about earlier on, the category of user that there's going to be, and different solutions for the different users, and different solutions and networks for the various different users, because there are a lot of different uses and needs out there for.
Well, I can happily comment on because we're dealing with major fleet operators. Their usage is very much between the hours of X and Y, and then they've got a set opportunity to charge these vehicles, and they've got that window of opportunity, and if they miss that window of opportunity, the vehicles are no longer fit for operation. And so that puts, coming back to this point of infrastructure, that puts a lot of pressure on ensuring that infrastructure is up to the task, because they literally don't have the level of flexibility that a domestic user would have, whereby I think there's some study that shows that domestic usage of vehicles, traditionally they're static for 80% of the time, so you have this level of flexibility. So I think for commercial organisations, there's actually a greater burden, but I can see commercial organisations being the first uptakers because it means so much to their business.
Okay.
I would just add, I think it comes back to the customer again. That you have to have the customer at the heart of this somehow. When it comes down to the argument of where these charges are, there's an awful lot of people out there who don't have a driveway, who don't have a garage, and who have only got on-street parking. So how we provide infrastructure that kind of caters for everyone, again, I think is going to require government and the private sector to come together, and that's, I guess, the holy grail, isn't it? Getting everyone working collaboratively to deliver something that actually suits the customer.
I think that challenge of kind of effectively reverse engineering something into an existing environment is is a really interesting challenge. And the thing that frustrates me so much nowadays is wheelie bins, because actually no house is designed with wheelie bins in mind, and even modern houses aren't. So actually we need to start thinking about house design, about layout of developments. That links to planning policy, but how, as you say, do you link that back into our kind of Victorian streets which don't have driveways where cars are on the pavement? Clearly we can't have cables strewn across the pavements everywhere, so there needs to be a different solution. And certainly some of the stuff that's moving forward at the moment, thinking about whether a lamp column should be just a lamp column, all those sorts of things are bits that we really need to look at carefully.
I think the point was well made in the TRL session yesterday around the concentration of freight on the strategic road network as well, and the fact that it's 2% of the network, but it's 2/3 of heavy freight, and that heavy freight is on it for most of its working time. And if you broaden that out into the major roads network, you can probably come up with a solution that looks at the charging needs or the alternative fuel needs of those heavy freight users in a way that's quite smart. And you can then start to think about what are the charging needs of lighter delivery vehicles as well, and come up with something certainly in the medium term that speaks to that need and is a different use case to, say, a commuter or an urban use case.
Okay. Well, we're nearly out of time, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go down the panel here and ask for their prediction. The more controversial, the better. Projecting forward 5 or 10 or 20 years, whichever you want to do. Give me a prediction for what we will be seeing. Daniel, do you want to kick off?
Okay, I'm going to be relatively controversial. I'm going to go out to 2030. I think we're going to start seeing autonomous vehicles. There'll be less need for ownership. There will actually be less pressure on the infrastructure then, because more vehicles can be used by more than one person. And I don't think the technology is the issue. I think it's going to be a legislation piece, so something for the lawyers, but I do think autonomous is coming.
Okay, so apart from the fact that in 2030 I probably still won't have perfected making a gin and tonic, I think actually I'm with Dan on the car ownership thing. So I actually think that vehicles as a service, rather than vehicles as something somebody owns, is going to be where we're going to be going, that you and I will be choosing a particular vehicle for a particular journey. If we're just going off on our own, we'll have a small car. If we need to take the family somewhere, or if we need to get some goods somewhere, we'll have something bigger, and we'll do that on an hourly rent basis, and probably have a bit like a mobile phone receipt every week coming through our door, telling us how much we've paid.
I'd absolutely echo that. I think connected and shared is the way forward. But I guess my prediction is probably slightly closer to home. I think we are going to see that kind of tipping point and that mass adoption. I think you're going to see an 8-fold increase in the next 5 years. There will be 1 million electric vehicles on the road in 5 years' time. Of that, I'm fairly positive.
Well, with loyally caution, I'll go for the 5-year window, and I'll say in 5 years' time we will have more electric charging points, we will have a better network, but it'll still be patchy. What we will have by then is a better idea of what the roadmap looks like to getting to a fuller low-carbon transport solution.
Okay, and I suppose Chair's prerogative, I'll finish up with my prediction. In 5 years' time, I still won't be using my Sinclair C5 to go to work. Thank you very much to firstly the audio crew, because it's very, very difficult if we're running a panel and they're having to flick in between people and the audience. So thanks. I think you did a fantastic job there. Much appreciated. Thank you all for coming along and for the questions from the floor. I hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, get out there, tweet, LinkedIn, all of that. That would be great. And of course, last but not least, thank you to the panel here. I'm pretty sure you'll have worked out that they know what they're talking about here. Collar them afterwards. If you want to come to our stand over there, you're very welcome. We'll have a chat to you. But thank you very much.